Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 will be our first one. Romans chapter 1. Slightly unusual lesson today. Hopefully it's not too odd and unusual. Whenever times like these happen, the question gets asked a lot by a lot of people. If there is a God, why would God allow all of these things to happen? My goal this morning is not to answer that question, but sometimes we do kind of question if there is a God because of the things that happen. I think that there are some good answers, and I think we could spend a lot of time answering or trying to answer or look at possible answers for those, but we're not going to do that. Here in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20, Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Paul just makes the simple observation here in verse 20 that things about God, or God himself, should be clearly seen in creation. And that this is something that has been happening, or should be evident ever since creation happened, is that there is a God. And obviously there's a lot of technical arguments we could make over, all these types of arguments we make. But I want to look at something small, something rather insignificant this morning. I want to look at just one animal and see if we can't see design inside of that one animal. Brittany loves birds, and for the past few years, we've been getting a lot more into bird watching and trying to understand the species, and she's got a book in the other room that has dog-eared pages and footnotes and things circled in it for all the birds that she's seen locally. And whenever I went to South Africa, all the guys were elbow me and tell me to get pictures of that bird so that Brittany would want to come with me next time, so that she'd be drawn to come to South Africa. But this one is one of her favorites, if not her favorite bird. I know it was her great-grandmother's favorite bird, and so this has always been one of her favorite. When she gets to see one, she just goes ecstatic. Hummingbirds are the smallest bird that there is, and I assumed whenever I started to look into information about them that it was going to be a bit of an easy thing to look through, and I found it to be quite the opposite. Hummingbirds are amazing. There's over 200 different species, and they all range from somewhere about 2 grams to 20 grams. To give you an idea, here you go, Levi. The average weight of a hummingbird is less than the weight of a nickel, to give you just an idea. The largest one is a Goliath hummingbird, and there's only one species that's this big. It's about 20 grams. The smallest is a bee hummingbird, and they fall victim to spiders. They get caught in spider webs. They're so small. And the average weight of all of the 200 species is that small. So to give you an idea, a nickel is not very much. There are 8 different organs that make up its digestive system. They have a special tongue that comes throughout their hollow beak that is comprised of a variety of muscles and bones. Their resting heart rate is 250 beats a minute. To give you an idea, if you ever get your heart rate up to 250 beats, it'll just blow out. There's just no way that you're going to survive that. Their flying heart rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,220 beats a minute. It's unbelievable. I thought, there's a really, really interesting question I want to find the answer to, so I Googled how many bones are in a hummingbird. And I thought I would get a really quick, simple answer, and I didn't. Because nobody can agree on what to count for their bone structure. I have a picture here of a hummingbird that's been kind of reconstructed after being deconstructed. And part of the reason why no one can agree is that they have an eye socket on both sides of their head, and then they have their eyelids. But inside the eyelid, if you notice here, there is a series of bones that hold the eye into the socket that's then connected with the outer tissue as well. And it is about 20 bones for that eye piece. But scientists can't agree to count that as one bone or count it as a variety of smaller bones. As well as their whole tongue aperture is comprised of muscle and bone, and they can't decide if they want to classify that as one bone or many bones. There's actually more vertebrae and more ribs in a hummingbird than most other bird species, and they vary according to the particular species of hummingbird. They also have different amount of toes, which also, if you want to get a short and simple answer, you're having a hard time. The young hummingbirds, their pelvic bones and their femurs are actually all disconnected bones that as they grow older, they fuse together. So again, how do you count that? The answer is I couldn't find anybody who would even give a rough estimate, but it's well over 100 bones to make up a hummingbird. But not only that, I asked Brittany to guess how many feathers there were. And I think you had guessed somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 or 300. And the answer is about 1,500 feathers that are interconnecting, waterproof, and iridescent. I mean, they're just some of the most beautiful birds that you can find and the most colorful that there are. Their breathing rate is 250 breaths per minute, where they inflate and deflate their lungs, but they have extra air sacs that make up all of the empty space in between the organs. You know, the structure of them is unbelievable. They have 39 different muscles that help them to fly. They have almost no strength in their feet. Their feet only hold on to grasp, and so almost all of their muscles are comprised of movement of the wings and the neck and their eating apparatus. You know, I want, if you were to imagine an engineering problem, you know, I'm going to give you an engineering problem. I want you to make something that's going to fly, that has a muscular system of some type, either biometrics, however you want to make it. It also has to have a digestive system so that it can replenish its own energy. Whether you want to be a solar power system, you can make it that way. It has to have a nervous system so that you have a neurofeedback loop so that you can receive input and act upon that. To go along with that, you have to have the CPU, something that's going to process all the information that it sees, and it's going to be able to meet its own needs. It needs to have a lymphatic system so that it can deal with diseases and problems that arise in this world. And a skeletal system, you have to have something to hold it all together, as well as a reproductive system and a vascular system to take all the nutrients and move it around the body. You have to make it waterproof, and you have to have, it has to be intelligent of its own volition. It has to be able to sustain flight for hours on end and migrate up to 500 miles in a single season. And it has to only weigh a nickel. We're talking about an engineering feat that would be impossible to go along with. 1,500 feathers, 39 different muscles, well over 100 different bones, a heart that can sustain over 1,200 beats a minute, a respiration system that can do 250 breaths per minute resting, let alone whenever it gets into active flight. Add in an additional 8 other just digestive organs, and you have to have all of that weigh less than a nickel. It is unbelievable. And so when Paul writes the Romans, and he says that the invisible attributes of God, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Hummingbirds are actually some of the least well-known birds. Because they are so small, it is hard to find their nest. I mean, the average nest is the size of a walnut, and the average hummingbird egg is the size of a pea. Their eggs are also breathable, much like all eggs. You know, if you were to go to the store and you buy a packet of eggs, you have to keep them refrigerated because of how we wash them. But if you go to pretty much any other country in the world, you don't have to wash them. You don't have to refrigerate them, because whenever they're laid, there's a protective film that goes over them that keeps them completely sealed and yet breathable. That as the chick or as the hatchling is going to grow inside there, it actually has to breathe through the shell. And so it's this porous enough and yet strong enough. The whole system is unbelievable. But hummingbirds, because they are so small and their nests are so small, that hardly anybody has ever filmed them or found them to film them being born or being fed. They are an incredible bird that almost nothing is known about. And yet that is just one animal, one type of bird, and on all the types of birds that there are, of one type of animal, of all the types of animals that there are, one type of life that is on the earth. It is unbelievable. So when Paul says that his divine nature and his eternal power is clearly perceived, I think it is without doubt if you just take some time to look at it. Brittany and I have been watching some nature documentaries with the kids, and there is one that's over dolphins. And they have one that's just what they show to everybody else, the whole, this is the dolphin movie, and then they have the making of the dolphin movie. So Brittany and I watched the making of because the kids weren't all that interested, and then the kids watched the dolphin one. And when we were watching the making of, they had just, they found this coral that the dolphins were rubbing up against, and they said this is a unique action that we've never seen dolphins do before. All of them line up and they go through this one particular coral, and there's only one coral in that entire reef, and they do this every day, and they're scratching their heads saying, we've never seen this in this reef or in any other reef. We've never seen dolphins do this, period. We don't know why. And so then they threw out a variety of different explanations. But whenever we watched the other video with the kids, it was, this is exactly what it's for, this is why they do it, they're intelligent enough to know that they're getting injured, and this is medicine for them. And Brittany and I realized that this happens all the time whenever you talk about science. That you have people who are making guesses on behaviors that they've seen once, and then they spout them off as fact for everybody else. And yet a lot of people put their faith in it. And what Paul encourages us to do is to take some time and to just look at the world around us and use our own reason and our own logic to understand God. Psalm 19, we'll look at two different psalms. David here is going to combine a couple things together that are really important to be combined together. Starting there in verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the ends of the heaven, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. And so you start in just in verses 1 through 6, he looks out, and he sees the things that he sees every day. Him growing up as a shepherd, this was his everyday life. He got to look out and see the sky above. And he says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. And day by day pours out speech, and night by night reveals knowledge. And then he describes the sun and the course that it takes. And you think, well, this would be one separate psalm, but in verse 7, he then not really changes directions, but he then expounds upon what you can understand about that. So he then launches into verse 7 that the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. And the commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And more to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them your servant is warned, in keeping them there is great reward. And I think sometimes we break apart Psalm 19 into two separate psalms. We deal verses 1 through 6 with looking at the nature around us and seeing that God's glory is revealed there and that his eternal attributes are named in the creation. And then in our song service, we sing verses 7 and following as a completely different psalm than verses 1 through 6. But David combines them together. He says, if you can look at the world around you and see the order and the strength and God's purpose that he put into the world, that also has to bleed through to his law. That if what we see is so perfect, then what God has told us also has to be equally perfect. And then he makes these connections, I think, between what we see in verses 1 through 6 throughout the next few sections. So the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. And the testimony is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart, and the commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eye. He then talks about some of the things that you find in nature, of the dripping of the honeycomb and much fine gold, and yet compared to those great things that God has made in the world, better is his word. And then there's this warning in verse 11, moreover your servant is warned, in keeping them there is great reward. And then in verse 12 he asks a very important question. Who can discern his errors? Declare me innocent from hidden faults, and keep back your servant from presumptuous sins, and let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. So he asks you to look in verses 1 through 6 at the world around you that God has made, and then specifically verses 7 through verse 11 at the law that also is there. And then in verse 12, the question is, well, who can discern God's errors? Who could point out what's wrong? Romans chapter 9, Paul asked the question in a very similar way of, can what is molded answer back to the molder, why have you made me this way? And sometimes the questions of why has God done things this way, or why has he allowed these things to happen, is really a futile exchange. It's rantings over things that we don't understand and maybe may never understand. The whole book of Job is 4 people going back and forth over things that they don't understand, for God to show up and not give answers, but to ask them more questions for them to understand how much they don't know. And so what David does here in verse 12 is, who can discern his errors? And he says here in verse 12, declare me innocent from hidden faults, and keep back your servant from presumptuous sins, presuming things, or believing that God has to do things in ways that we expect him. And so verse 14 is, let the word of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. And instead of understanding everything of why God does what he does, rather to let us meditate on them. And let those words be on our mouth and the meditations of our heart, and let that be right in God's sight. We had spent some time on Wednesday night looking at Psalm 8. And here again, David combines some of these elements together. He begins with the praise of God in verses 1 and 2. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemies and the avenger. And sometimes we skip over verse 1 and verse 2 and we jump right to verse 3, but he begins with the praise of God and his purpose in his creation. And then you look at verse 3. When I look at the heavens and the works of your fingers, and the moon and the stars that you have set in place. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? That is a really good question. all the things that God has made and all the care and intricacy that he has put into place. It's astounding. I was doing some research on savants, the people who just seem to know things, or individuals who are acquired savants who get a head injury and then wake up the next morning knowing how to play the piano perfectly. The guy who is the leading expert says that savants and acquired savants give us an indication that we are born with pre-programmed information from our maker. That is a really good observation. I know a few months ago we had talked about the idea of instinct. I don't know if you guys were there for that one or not. The animals are born with instincts. Humans are born with the instinct to eat. No one has to teach them. They don't learn that through observation. It's just born in them. And DNA does not give any indication or any answer for why instincts exist. And they're a product of God, and yet all the scientists say, well, this animal has this instinct, therefore it must be a product of evolution. But there is absolutely no evidence that our minds are created with that from our DNA. It's just, it doesn't exist. So you have animals who spawn, in particular areas, even though they've never been there before, or they moved away from there over all these years. We had, elephants migrate over 1,000 miles through land where you have watering holes that are just sparse, and yet they have to remember every one of them by instinct. There are so many things that go along with this, and you look at the intricacy of the world, and you have to understand that there is a designer, there is a maker. And so David marvels at all of this in verse 4. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? And yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and have given him dominion over the works of your hand, and have put all things under his feet. Now, we had also mentioned on Wednesday that these verses are quoted in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 6 through verse 8. While David is specifically speaking here of us, that God has cared for us and shown us care, this is also a prophecy of Jesus, that there was going to be someone who would come and God will put all things under his feet. And through that, show us even greater care. There's more care that David writes about than David understood that he was writing about. And that God was going to send someone to redeem us from all of our sins, and that whenever we die, that we don't end. Solomon asked the question in Ecclesiastes, well, who knows whether when an animal dies, his soul goes into the ground, and man, that his soul goes to heaven? Well, the answer is God knows. But the idea being there is that when an animal dies, we understand that that's just the end of that animal. But God cares for us enough to give us an eternal nature to go along with that. And not only to give us an eternal nature, but to then give us a hope and an opportunity to use that to live with him forever. And all these ideas kind of have to go hand in hand. We start there in Romans chapter 1, where he mentions that God's eternal power and his divine nature are clearly seen in creation. David in Psalm 19 looks at creation and goes, if God has done this so well, then surely his law is also equally as good and better. And he also makes a point here in chapter 8, or Psalm 8, that looking at all that God has done, that God cares for us above all else in his creation. And then there's this prophecy that I don't think David understood or even knew that he was writing at the time. This talk about God's ultimate care for us. And you pick anything in creation, something as large as the planetary system around us, or something as small as a hummingbird, and God's divine nature and his eternal power is clearly perceived. And then from that we should be able to deduce what David deduced, that his law is perfect and more precious than anything in creation. And that God giving us a law and caring for us as he does proves how much he cares for us. And whatever happens here, if you die of coronavirus, you die of a heart attack, or just old age, or an accident, that there is something better that God has still provided for us. Sometimes We do things for our children that our children have no idea why we do them. And they are just so heartbroken until they see around the corner what we had ultimately planned. And sometimes that's how we are. We get so upset about what happens right now, forgetting that God has something around the corner that is so much better. Well, thank you for your time. We will have our closing song, and then Josh will close us in prayer.